most often cited by people over the course of a 20-year career, mostly with the New York Times as a foreign correspondent and bureau chief. He has filed stories from more than 50 countries on 5 continents. Can you hear me? Okay. 50, that's 50, let me repeat that because it's stunning. 50 countries and 5 continents. If the breadth and scope of his work does not impress you, the mere scope of his frequent flyer miles ought to. And it isn't just journalism that he's done, not just foreign correspondence. Professor Kinzer has taught at Northwestern, at Boston University, and at Brown University. And it isn't just journalism that he's taught. He's also had courses in foreign relations and political science. His 8 books also scan the globe. He's made subjects out of Turkey, Iran, Nicaragua, Rwanda, Guatemala. His original writing in books and in articles that still run frequently in major New York and London newspapers could basically constitute a formidable reading list for several college courses. There is, however, in all of this scope of work, a very discernible thread. It's a theme that runs through it. It's a theme that makes him a particularly relevant speaker today at this junction in U.S. history. And the theme is this. It's that U.S. interventionist policies, its exercise of global power has caused turmoil, it's hurt democracy, and it's just kind of disgraceful. It's not exactly the kind of American exceptionalism that we're used to hearing about from our politicians. In his latest book, Stephen Kinzer has examined the Cold War, and he's pointed a finger of blame at 2 American brothers, the Dulleses. One was head of the CIA, the other was Secretary of State. He's blamed them as the architects of that very dark time, a time that many fear we may be returning to. And along those lines, Kinzer has also reported that the hand of America has been very visible in the turmoil that we see in Ukraine. He says, persuasively I think, that its policy of isolating Russia and of spending time hurting its former satellites into NATO has helped to scare, to warn Putin and to provoke him. The title of his 2006 book is interesting. It's Overthrow, America's Century of Regime Change, from Hawaii to Iraq. So, in other words, as that sums up, we've been at this for a long time. There is, I think, a sweep of history as well as distance in the work that this man has produced. He's a student of war, of culture, of human motives over time, and yet in that newspaper fashion, he boils it down very briefly and succinctly. About Ukraine, for example, he wrote that Egypt, Libya, Syria, have all gone through the same thing. They all have learned that, quote, these upheavals rarely end well. Pretty much puts it together. I do have a better feeling about tonight's presentation. I think things will end well, and I'm going to turn it over right now to Marcel. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. It's great to be with a bunch of other non-NCAA fans. We had all agreed that if University of Albany got into the final game of the NCAA playoffs, we were going to cancel this event. But it didn't happen that way. It's just must have fallen out of competition at the last moment. Well, it's wonderful to be here. The organizers of this group really put the arm on me to be sure to get me out here. They were relentless. Women Against War. What's not to like with a name like that? It's being against war and women are always been 2 of my favorite things in life. When you add Writers Institute to that, it's really irresistible for me. Now, this is a really interesting moment that we're in the United States, and I don't think interesting is always a good thing. I have a friend who told me you never want to be interesting to your doctor. So you really rather have some moments that aren't interesting, but that's not good for us as journalists. There's no foreign correspondents in Norway. Things are too good there. But fortunately, there's plenty of other places for us. And part of the reason for that is the people that we're here to talk about tonight. I now have Turner Classic Movies on my cable list, and I like to watch those old movies. And I saw one the other night that had a line in it that just really struck me because I thought it essentially encapsulates my whole career. Some of you might know this movie called Arsenic and Old Lace with Cary Grant. So the story is there's several elderly sisters. They run a rooming house and they poison the guests. And Cary Grant is their young nephew who shows up and slowly realizes what's happening. So there's one scene where one of the elderly ladies gently says to Cary Grant, "Oh, the gentleman died because he drank wine that had poison in it." And Cary Grant, who's slowly realizing what's happening, says, "But how did the poison get in the wine?" Actually, it's to answer that question that I've devoted my whole career. I'm not going to write a memoir ever, I don't think, but if I ever do, I think I have the title. How did the poison get in the wine? We look around the world and we see upheaval in so many places. And we read about this in the news all the time, at least I hope we do, when we're not too busy following the latest Kardashian breakup. But all we're finding out about when we read the news is what's happening today. After many years of being a newsman, now that I'm not doing that anymore, I can finally admit that I'm actually not interested in news. I don't like news. I've come to conclude that news is actually sometimes a big distraction, because news is all about what's happening today, right now. And it saturates us to the point that in our search for trying to figure out what's happening today, we fail to ask two other questions which are actually more important than what's happening today. One is, what happened yesterday? How did the poison get in the wine? How did we get to where we are now? And the other question is, what's going to happen tomorrow? What does what just happened mean? What is it going to produce? The bombardment of news about what's happening at this instant pushes aside those other considerations. And that's why I think sometimes news can be a distraction. As we look around the world and try to look at the roots of modern crises, I think we have to go back and do something that Americans really don't like to do, and that's try to understand how our own actions have created our own problems in the modern day. Many of today's crises have their roots back in the 1950s when we shaped the post-war world. I had written a book about how the Americans overthrew the democratic government of Guatemala in 1954. Later, I wrote a book about the American overthrow of the government of Iran in 1953. And in both of those books, the characters of the Dulles brothers kind of walked across the pages. But after a while, I came to realize that they were not minor characters. Actually, they were central figures in the history of the 20th century. I think that's one of the reasons why we have forgotten. They're teaching us lessons that we really don't want to learn. Now, when I started working on this project, one of the first things that I did was I found a video on YouTube of President Kennedy opening Dulles Airport in 1961. So it was named after Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, who had recently died. And in that film clip, I see President Kennedy speaking to a small group of select dignitaries. Mrs. John Foster Dulles, the widow, was present. Former President Eisenhower was there. Allen Dulles, the younger brother who was still alive, was there. And Kennedy made a nice little speech, and then he pulled back the curtain to show that big bust of John Foster Dulles that stands in the middle of Dulles Airport. So I watched this clip a couple of times, and I realized that although I've been through Dulles Airport, I never saw that bust.
I must have just missed it. I walked right by it. So I decided now that I'm writing a book about the Dulles brothers, I want to go on my next trip. I'm going to route myself through Dulles Airport. And I want to go stand in front of that bus. So I got off the plane. I asked the first security guard I met, well, where's the Dulles bus? I just got a blank look. I didn't know what I was talking about. Well, I thought, some guy that just hired. I asked the next one and the next one. Nobody had ever heard of the Dulles bus. They didn't know where it was. In fact, one guy even said to, in a little frustration, I said, he said, I don't know what you're talking about. I said, well, who do you think this airport was named after? And he said, some guy named Dulles, I guess. I was very puzzled by this. And I had to get on my plane. I never found it. Then, it's a long story. I had to make a lot of phone calls and emails. And I finally arranged on my next visit to Dulles Airport to be met by a representative of the Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority who had agreed to take me to see the bust of John Foster Dulles. She took me down to show me the bust. It's in a closed conference room opposite baggage claim number 3. So this is the perfect metaphor for what happened to the Dulles brothers and their memory. When I was working on this book, my friends were asking me, as they sometimes do, so what are you working on now? What are you writing about? And I'd say, I'm writing a book about Dulles. And they would say, the airport? Now, this is how I began my research, and I actually, when you look at my book, you'll see this story like on page 1 and page 2. That's how I opened my book, the story about how the bus has disappeared, and how this is kind of a metaphor. I think the reason we've pushed them out of our memory is that they have lessons to teach us that we don't want to learn. Actually, the Dulles brothers' approach to the world did not work out well for us, and therefore, rather than confront that fact and see if we can draw some lessons for the future from that, it's easier just to forget them and push them out of our national memory. So I've been saying this in a number of speeches since my book came out a few months ago, and as I said, it's on the first couple of pages of the book. About 2 weeks ago, I got a very excited phone call from a friend of mine, and he said, he said, I'm calling you from Dulles Airport. You won't believe what happened. They've taken the bus out of the storage room. It's back in the center of the airport. Hey, the power of the press. It's awesome. And then, of course, as always happens when you start to feel self-satisfied, it didn't take me very long to realize, wait a minute, did I do a good thing or did I do a bad thing? And now, of course, he's being placed back in the center of Dulles Airport with no context, and maybe he's just being shown again as a hero. So I think my next step is going to be to make sure there's a little kiosk or a table right next to the bus where they're selling copies of my book. But I think I might have a little trouble with that one. So let me take you a little bit through the story of the Dulles brothers. I think one of the things that's fascinating about them is one contrast. On the one hand, they're truly extraordinary figures. They really had a unique background and unique lives. On the other hand, they're actually quintessentially American. They represent us. The forces that created them created this country and created our approach to the world and still shape the way that we view the world. So understanding them is a good way for us to understand ourselves and our country and the way we deal with the rest of the world. So as many of you know, in the 1950s, John Foster Dulles was Secretary of State, and his younger brother Allen Dulles was director of the CIA. It's the only time in history that siblings have controlled the overt and the covert sides of American foreign policy. This turned out to be something very dangerous because these two brothers had grown up so intimately together and they saw the world in exactly the same way. Once they were in these high positions of power, they never felt the need to consult anyone else. Just a wink or a nod between the two of them and governments would collapse. During the 1950s, there probably was not a literate human being on Earth who did not know the name Dulles, because they could make and break governments, and they did. But now they've been almost completely forgotten. And my book is an attempt to kind of bring them back from obscurity and recognize them for their contributions to American life. I want to use them as a way to help us re-examine ourselves and our country. So I mentioned that the forces that created the Dulles brothers are the forces that created us and still shape us. So what were those forces? First of all, the Dulles brothers grew up as kids in a little town, not so far from here actually, on Lake Ontario, Watertown, New York. It was kind of a playground for the New York rich. At one time it had the highest per capita income of any community in the United States. But the Dulles family, at least their father was not a plutocrat. He was a clergyman. He was the Presbyterian minister of Watertown, New York. So he was preaching to the plutocrats, but wasn't one of them himself. Now, the two boys grew up in the parsonage, in a religious environment, and every morning in the summers, they started their days the same way. So they'd get up and take a cold shower. That was the only kind Reverend Dulles allowed. He thought it built character. Then they would spend about a half an hour praying and singing hymns, and then they were free, and they could run down to the lakefront where their two older relatives who doted on them were waiting. In particular, that huge influence in their upbringing was their grandfather, who had been Secretary of State, and also there was their uncle, who was also Secretary of State. So it was a little bit of an unusual family. Now, their grandfather Foster, was known to history as Secretary of State John Watson Foster. Elderly, extravagantly bewhiskered, old Republican war horse. Grandfather Foster was a fascinating figure. So he had lived the classic pioneer life in the age of manifest destiny. He had gone to the West and conquered the wilderness and fought the savages and built himself a business and ingratiated himself to powerful men. He got into politics. He bought a newspaper, which he cited. He brought into politics as a result of this and helping get people elected. He was named to several diplomatic posts and ultimately became Secretary of State. I was able to figure out that John Watson Foster was actually the first Secretary of State in American history to preside over the overthrow of a foreign government. That was Hawaii, 1893. So I'm wondering if there's some kind of a genetic predisposition to regime change in the Dulles family. In any case, those four people, young Foster Dulles and young Allen Dulles, who were 7, 8, 10, 12 years old, and Grandfather Foster and Uncle Bert, later known to history as Secretary of State Robert Lansing, would go out onto Lake Ontario stalking the smallmouth bass. But those were not just fishing trips. Those trips were a cascade of lessons in American history, in which Grandfather Foster communicated to the boys his idea of what we now call American exceptionalism. It's the view that the United States has a providential mission. That all of human history from the time of the Neanderthals has been a process of leading to the creation of the United States of America. God has given this blessed country the key to prosperity and stability. He has shown us how nations should be governed and how churlish it would be for us to hold this secret to ourselves. We need to go out and project it, particularly to those people who are so backward that they don't even understand that they need our help and think that they're happy living the way they are. So this was the way that John Watson Foster, the grandfather, had lived his life. He inculcated in his grandsons the idea that America is destined to spread its ideas and its power far and wide. Now, of course, he imagined this as being an idea that would play out inside North America. The young boys then took that around the world. It's really remarkable when you think about the shortness of the curve of American history. The grandfather had campaigned for Abraham Lincoln, and the grandsons projected American power all over the world in the nuclear age. So this was certainly one force that created them, this deep belief in American exceptionalism. What it tells you is that many countries in the world are very selfish and they're greedy. And when they act in the world, they act for their own benefit. And this is very bad because it upsets the world. But the United States is not like that. We don't act selfishly. We only act actually for the benefit of the world. And in fact, we sacrifice our interests to help other people. Therefore, we must impose rules on the rest of the world so those crazy, selfish, and greedy countries don't go wild. But we don't have to obey those rules because we are not selfish and greedy. This is the exceptionalist idea that the Dulles brothers inculcated, assimilated from their grandfather and their uncle during those years, those whole summers long of fishing trips. In the wintertime, Grandfather Foster would bring the kids to Washington, to his house on DuPont Circle for months. And they would sit there at the dinner table with senators and cabinet ministers and ambassadors and Woodrow Wilson and William Howard Taft and Bernard Baruch. All the elite of America were sitting there. And actually, it's really interesting. The boys, as children, were not allowed to participate in those dinner discussions, but they were listening. And after they would go to bed, young Allie, he was then called then, wouldn't go right to bed. He would sit at his desk and he would make little notes to himself. He would write down everybody who was at the dinner, what they said, and what he, Allie, then thought what they really meant behind what they said. Here's a kid who's 8 years old, the future head of the CIA, which has not even been created yet. And he's already writing what are, in essence, intelligence reports to himself. So this belief in American exceptionalism was a key force creating the Dulles brothers. Second force that created them was part of their religious upbringing, and that is the precepts that shape missionary Calvinism. They grew up accepting some fundamental Calvinist principles. First of all, this religious tradition teaches that there's a true religion, the right religion, and then there's all the religions that have the wrong idea about the world. In fact, that's very sad because those people are not just wrong, but they're condemned to eternal damnation. So there's the right thing to believe about God and wrong things to believe. Now, if you believe this about religion, it's a very short step to believing the same thing about politics, that there's a right way to have a country and a wrong way, and also about people, that there are good people, then there's evil people. Everything is divided in this tradition between good and evil, right and wrong. Many people in other cultures do not grow up with this approach. They're taught something different, which is that all of us are made up of some good and some evil impulses, and these come out in different proportions according to different situations. But the Dulles brothers did not believe this. Now, another piece of this Calvinist ideology that they assimilated as kids was the missionary instinct. So their father was a Presbyterian clergyman. So was their grandfather. So were their great uncle. So was their uncle. So was their great great grandfather. And they were not just clergymen, but many of them were missionaries. And in fact, many returning missionaries from China and Syria and other places would come to the Dulles household in the when they would come back on their rotations back to the United States. So the Dulles boys grew up with this idea that you have to go out into the world and convert people. It's not enough in this religious tradition to sit home and hope that people on the other side of the world realize the error of their ways and embrace the true faith. You have to go out in the world and make them change. You're saving them. Again, if you believe this about religion, it's a very short step to believing the same thing about politics. That there's one way to run a country, and the people who are running it any other way are running it wrong, and it's our job to go out and stop them from doing that. So these principles of missionary Calvinism are a second force that created the Dulles brothers. And I believe this missionary instinct is still very powerful in the United States. Now, Americans are very compassionate people. We hate the idea that people are suffering anywhere. Our leaders know this. And whenever they plan interventions anywhere in the world for any purpose, they always cloak the interventions in this humanitarian garb, because they know we respond to this. When we see pictures of people suffering or brutalized in other countries, we want to go act. We don't stop to think, well, is our action really going to help? Is it going to create a better situation for human rights over the long run? All we want to do is get involved, do something right now. And I think this impulse is something that our leaders take advantage of. So that's the second force that created the Dulles brothers, and I think very important in understanding our own approach to the world. The third force that shaped them definitely was their decades of service to American corporate power. So the Dulles brothers spent most of their adult lives working at this extraordinary Wall Street law firm called Sullivan and Cromwell. Even to call it a law firm is a little bit misleading. It did do some things that law firms do. If you really needed to be represented in a courtroom, for example, they could do that. Or if you needed a contract drawn up, they had people who could do that. But that's not why anybody hired Sullivan and Cromwell. This law firm had a specialty. And the specialty was pressuring small countries to do what big American corporations wanted them to do. They were the preeminent masters of this skill. And that is why every major American multinational corporation had Sullivan and Cromwell as its legal counsel. They represented every big American corporation that had interests abroad. And they did it for decades and decades. The stories of their cases are remarkable. Just to give one example, when Foster Dulles was just a young associate, he had just joined the firm, there was trouble in Cuba. The Conservative Party had been in power. There had been an election. The Liberals had won the election. The Liberals favored limiting the amount of land that foreigners could own in Cuba. So big American corporations that were sponsored by, worked with the conservative government, told them, don't give up power. You lost the election, but just ignore that fact. Stay in power. Needless to say, the Liberals began a protest. They began a rebellion to have the election results recognized. Well, this greatly upset United Fruit and a bunch of other American companies that all had Sullivan and Cromwell as their lawyers. So they went to Sullivan and Cromwell and said, well, this is what we hired you for. Protect our interests in another country. We've got trouble in Cuba. Make the trouble go away. So, young Foster Dulles was given the case. He got on the train in Penn Station in New York. He went to Washington to have a chat with Uncle Bert, otherwise known as Secretary of State Lansing. He explained the situation, and Uncle Bert asked him, well, what should we do? So young Foster said, well, we should send soldiers to Cuba to put down that liberal rebellion. The next day, 2 American warships were sent to Cuba. 6,000 Marines debarked. They put down the liberal rebellion, and they began what wound up being a 5-year occupation of Cuba. So that's what Sullivan and Cromwell did for a living. And I want to tell you that there never was any trouble in Cuba after that. It calmed down. Unfortunately, that's not the way the 20th century played out. Maybe some people in Cuba didn't forget what Sullivan and Cromwell had done year after year in Cuba. And you can repeat that for many, many other countries. It's logical that when the Dulles brothers came into power, they would have been shaped by what they'd been doing their whole lives. They came to associate the interests of big American corporations with the interests of the United States. And when they became the 2 people who ran American foreign policy, they took that same approach to the world that they'd taken during all those years when they were at Sullivan and Cromwell. Now, interestingly enough, the Dulles brothers, although they were twins politically and ideologically, had very, very different private lives. In their personalities, they were total opposites. So the older brother, John Foster Dulles, was dour, egotistical, arrogant, socially awkward, very confrontational. Winston Churchill once said he's the only bull I know who carries his own china shop around with him. But I even like another great quote from another future British Prime Minister. The British are so great with insults. He said, about Foster Dulles, he said, his speech was slow, but it easily kept pace with his thoughts. So Foster was very stiff and unpleasant. I read somewhere even his friends didn't like him. Allen was just the opposite. Allen was a bon vivant, a wine connoisseur, a tennis player, sparkling conversationalist. He was like a figure out of The Great Gatsby. Very appealing, very attractive, sparkling. He had 100 mistresses from Claire Booth Luce to the Queen of Greece. And I think this is important because Allen Dulles, as director of the CIA, was not just head of the invisible government. He was also the ambassador of the invisible government to the visible government. And I think a lot of people went home from those Georgetown cocktail parties thinking, we don't really know what the CIA is, we don't know what the CIA does, but if it's being run by such a wonderful guy like that, it must be fine. This was a time when most people had never heard of the expression CIA. In fact, one time a journalist asked Allen Dulles, so what is the CIA? And he said, think of us as the State Department for unfriendly countries. Now, one of the themes of my book is that we've misunderstood the history of the 1950s. We think of that as a period of peace, tense peace. But actually, the Dulles brothers were waging an unbroken world war all during the 1950s. We didn't see it because it was being waged covertly and clandestinely. And when it did pop up into public view, as happened periodically, like in Guatemala or in Indonesia, where we fomented a civil war, Americans were told that that was just a local uprising. We didn't know anything about it. And that's how this combination of the overt and covert brothers was so effective. The system would be that Foster Dulles would start making speeches about Country X, and how Country X was dangerously drifting toward communism, and that leader was very bad. And then Allen would work to foment upheaval and dissent and turmoil in that country. And when the turmoil broke out, Foster would then make a speech saying, it's wonderful to see how the patriotic people of Country X on their own are rising up to challenge their Marxist masters. And Americans didn't have the information to interpret this and understand what was happening. It's only long afterward that we can put the pieces together and come to the conclusion, this is how the poison got into the wine. Now, I could cite a whole series of examples, but since Iran is very much on our minds these days, let me talk a little bit about the Dulles brothers involved in Iran. Because our trouble with Iran and Iran's trouble with itself really goes back to this era. And this is a story that also shows you how seamlessly the Dulles brothers moved from serving American corporations and having the corporations pay them, and serving American corporations and being paid by the US taxpayers. So, Allen Dulles found a spectacular client in Iran in the late 1940s. It was in 1949. Allen Dulles had been the chief of the Middle East division in the State Department back in the 1920s. He was quite familiar with the rulers in the Middle East. In the late 1940s, in the period after World War II, a new corporation emerged in the United States, very ambitious. It was a conglomerate made up of all the biggest engineering firms in the United States. It was called OCI. It was Overseas Consultants, Inc. And they had a classically American, super ambitious idea. Their project was going to be find countries that are poor and backward and turn them into rich, prosperous countries so everybody can live just like they're in Bermuda. And they felt that in typical American fashion, this is something you could do with social engineering and economic investment. Culture wouldn't play any role. You didn't need to know about the culture of these countries. So they put together a 5-volume proposal for Iran. It's probably the most detailed study that's ever been made of Iran. How many lines of, how many miles of pipe are there in Khorasan province? What sorts of diseases do the sheep have in northeastern Iran? And this is going to be the most expensive overseas development program in history. Iran was a good target because Iran was making money from its oil revenues and could count on foreign aid from the United States, particularly if the aid was going to be used to pay a big American corporation. The only thing that OCI needed was they needed to close the deal with the Shah. Shah was still quite young. He was uncertain. Democracy was emerging in Iran. He didn't know what his position would be. OCI needed somebody to go to Tehran and close the deal. They hired Allen Dulles. Allen Dulles, as a private lawyer, went to Iran. He met with the Shah. Immediately afterwards, the Shah agreed to sign this enormous contract. So, Allen Dulles had the greatest legal triumph of his career. Finally had a client with global ambition just as big as his own. But then what happened? Democracy began to consolidate itself in Iran, and a movement called the National Front emerged. That was led by Mohammad Mossadegh, who became prime minister in 1951. The National Front decided they didn't like the idea of thousands of Americans fanning out over Iran, transforming the country by bringing in new industries and changing rivers and reorienting the economy and the society, and they canceled the project. So here, Allen Dulles came up with 2 ideas about Iran. Number one, our man there is the Shah. He did what we wanted. He did the right thing in signing this contract. And our enemy is Mossadegh, the leader of the National Front, who represents the chaos of irresponsible democracy, whereas the Shah represents the wisdom of authoritarian rule. Now, shortly after that, Sullivan and Cromwell suffered another blow. They had lost this huge OCI contract. Then Mossadegh, with the unanimous vote of both houses of the Iranian parliament, nationalized the Iranian oil industry. Well, this was a terrible blow for anybody that represented multinational corporations. You don't want to give the idea that countries can nationalize their own resources and get away with it. That can destroy the entire system by which the world economy functions. And not only that, Iranian oil was all owned by one British company. And the bank of that company, the financial agent for that company, was something called the Schroeder Bank, which was a big international bank. And Schroeder Bank's lawyers was Sullivan and Cromwell. And in fact, Allen Dulles was on the board of Schroeder Bank. So he had to go to them and say, we failed you. You hired us to protect your interest in Iran. You just lost your interest. The Dulles brothers did not forget this. They had lost this huge OCI contract because of the elected leader of Iran. And then that same elected leader had caused their bank, one of their major clients, to lose its interest in Iran. As private lawyers, there wasn't anything they could do about that. But when they came to power, they focused immediately on Mossadegh. In fact, they didn't even wait to be sworn into office before they started the plot against Mossadegh. By that summer, Mossadegh was gone. The CIA overthrew him in August of 1953. And that was not just the downfall of one leader. That was the end of democracy in Iran forever. It was followed by 25 years of repressive rule by the Shah, as we know. That produced the explosion of the late 1970s, what we call the Islamic Revolution. That brought to power this intensely anti-American fundamentalist religious group that has been tormenting Iran ever since. All of this has its roots back in the American meddling in Iran in 1953. If we had not done that, if we had held ourselves back and simply allowed Iran to evolve on its own, we might have had a thriving democracy in the heart of the Muslim Middle East all these 60 years. And I can hardly wrap my mind around how different the Middle East and the world might be had that been the case. One reason why the Dulles Brothers War was not noticed at the time is that the theater of operations kept changing. So it started in Iran, and then next year they overthrew the government of Guatemala. Then it kept moving. They had operations against leaders in Indonesia, India, Iran, Cuba, Egypt, the Congo. It kept their targets kept shifting. As we look back on their legacy, I think we can draw some important lessons from historic misjudgments that the Dulles brothers made. Their first big misjudgment was their principle that the United States should never negotiate with any enemies or rival countries. You should only talk to your friends. When it comes to your enemies, just don't talk, don't negotiate, and in the end, you're going to get what you want. Now, the Dulles brothers had only been in office of course, they came in at the beginning of 1953 with Eisenhower. They'd only been in office a few weeks when Stalin died in Moscow. After that, peace feelers began emerging from the Kremlin. At the end of 1953, a summit meeting was held in Bermuda with what was then called the Big Three. That was Britain, France, and the United States. And one of the items on the agenda was a request from the new leader in the Kremlin, Malenkov, for a summit that he called Big Four. So let's get together France, Britain, United States, and Soviet Union. Churchill, who represented Britain there, thought this was a great idea. The French were all for it, but Foster Dulles was totally against it. He vetoed it. He refused to allow it, and that summit never happened. With this policy, I think Foster Dulles intensified and lengthened the Cold War because they refused to consider possible options. They refused even to sit down for discussions. And why did they do this? They were very clear. They had their own reason, and it's actually one that you can understand. They felt that the whole Cold War paradigm was based on the realization that we were not just facing a country that was our enemy or didn't like us. We were facing the latest incarnation of the force of barbarism and nihilism that has always threatened civilization. These were not people you could speak with. And they felt that if the American people would start seeing pictures of their leaders sitting around the table with Soviet leaders, this paradigm would break down because it might lead Americans to think, well, maybe they're human beings too, and we give them our ideas, and they give us their ideas, and we'll talk, and who knows, we might come up with something. The Dulles brothers didn't want that. They felt that society then dissolves. You lose your cohesiveness. You don't have an enemy to focus on. The strength of your society dissipates. So maintaining the paradigm of conflict was a principle for the Dulles brothers. That was a big misjudgment. The second misjudgment they made was that the Dulles brothers completely misunderstood the nature of third world nationalism. In the period after World War II, dozens of countries in Asia and Africa and Latin America were emerging from different kinds of colonialism. They were looking for their place in a turbulent new world. Many of these countries were terribly underdeveloped. And the nationalist leaders they produced were focused entirely on internal development. They didn't want to become involved in the Cold War. And these were the leaders who became known as neutralists. Now, Foster Dulles hated neutralism. He used the word immoral, fundamentally immoral, to describe it. I think he hated neutralism even more than he hated Bolshevism. And the reason was this. The Bolsheviks at least told you they were communists. But the neutralists were trying to trick you. So who were these neutralists? Well, Mossadegh in Iran would be one of them. Arbenz in Guatemala. There was Sukarno in Indonesia. Patrice Lumumba in the Congo. Nehru in India. Nasser in Egypt. These were all people who tried to stay out of international conflict. Sukarno had a phrase for it. He called it Madang and Paradua Karang, to row between two reefs. But Foster Dulles did not believe that these people, these neutralist leaders who I just listed, were what they said they were. He thought they were actually part of a conspiracy that had been hatched in the Kremlin. And the conspiracy was this, as Foster Dulles imagined it, that the Soviets had decided there were certain countries in the world that they couldn't take over right away. Conditions weren't right. So what they would do is get one of their lackeys in that country to pose as a nationalist and a neutralist and not say that he was actually working for the Kremlin. And then try to calm down the world by preaching neutralism until the appropriate moment came. Then he would let the axe fall and bring his country immediately behind the Iron Curtain. It was this complete misunderstanding that led the United States to turn leaders like the ones I just mentioned and many of the people in their countries into enemies of the United States, when actually they were embracing what we would like to think of as fundamental American principles. It was all because of this good versus evil idea that they had believed since childhood. Those leaders I mentioned were not 100% pro-American. That made them enemies. And this, again, is a paradigm we still fall into. Either you're with us or you're with the fill in the blank. In those days it was communist, later it became terrorists. There's always some way to divide the world between good and evil, and of course, everybody who does that always places himself on the bad side. The third huge misjudgment that the Dulles brothers made, and Eisenhower with them, is they had no conception of what we would today call blowback. It never occurred to them that their clandestine operations and covert regime change projects, although successful at the moment in achieving the short-term goal, might have huge, terrible long-term consequences, not only for the target country, but also for the United States. Iran is one great example. Cuba is another. Vietnam is another. Think of the toll that our engagement with those countries has cost us as well as the rest of the world. Those are all blowback from our own interventions. Now, in this case, I could imagine the Dulles brothers might have an excuse. If they could be here today, they might say, in their own defense, we had no idea that these kinds of operations can have terrible effects 50 years later, because 50 years before we were in power, there were no covert operations. Those days, we just landed the Marines on the shores. So that could be an excuse that they would use, but we don't have that excuse today. We now know what blowback is and how devastating it can be, not just for the world, but also for our own security. I'm all about countries acting in their own interests. I think that's the only real guide for countries. I'm all for the United States doing what's good for the United States. But let's stop and think about what's really good for us over the long run, and not take steps that make us feel good for a moment, but in the long run actually wind up undermining our own national security. That's maybe the lesson I'd like to say if I could have the Dulles brothers in front of me. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that I finally had the triumph of my life by getting that bus back into Dulles Airport. I have to tell you that from an artistic point of view, all of you people who've never had a chance to see that bust are not missing anything. It's not very well done, actually. Foster Dulles looks kind of bug-eyed and unpleasant. The proportions are a little off. Mrs. Dulles paid the sculptor. I don't think she maybe went out and bought the highest talent that was out there. So from an artistic standpoint, maybe the closed conference room by baggage claim number 3 was an appropriate spot. But there is a masterpiece of American art, and I say American in the broadest sense, the art of the Americans, that has the Dulles brothers as central figures. This I consider to be truly one of the greatest pieces of political art of the 20th century. It is a 16-foot-long mural on linen painted by the Mexican muralist Diego Rivera. It's called Glorious Victory. That was the phrase that Foster Dulles used when he went on the radio after overthrowing the democratic government of Guatemala and imposing dictatorship that later spiraled it down into a horrific 30-year civil war into which hundreds of thousands were massacred. Foster Dulles called this a glorious victory. So that is the title of this amazing Diego Rivera mural. Here's the story behind the mural. So after the Americans overthrew the Arbenz government in Guatemala, that was in June of 1954, there was a huge outburst of protest in Latin America. There were anti-American demonstrations in practically every Latin American capital. There were marches on American embassies and so forth. And this happened, among other countries, in Mexico, where Diego Rivera was living. At that time, Diego Rivera's wife, Frida Kahlo, was very ill and was under doctor's orders not to leave her bed. She was so outraged by the overthrow of democracy in Guatemala that she told her husband, Diego Rivera, "We're going to march. We got to go in the protest march, and I don't care about the doctors. I'm going." And I've actually found a photograph of that protest march in Mexico as they're going by the U.S. Embassy. Right in the front, there's Diego Rivera pushing the wheelchair in which the blanket-shrouded figure of Frida Kahlo is clearly visible. That was the last time Frida Kahlo ever left her bed. She died 11 days later. And Diego Rivera set out to paint this picture, Glorious Victory. Those of you that will see my book will notice that in the back of the photo section, I've reproduced a picture of this, a reproduction of this painting. It's a pitiful reproduction. It's very small. It's black and white, but you get the point. So more or less, this is what the picture shows. In the middle is John Foster Dulles with a big grin on his face, and he's shaking hands with Castillo Armas, the Guatemalan lackey that he has just placed in as dictator of Guatemala. Right behind him is Allen Dulles, with a satchel around his waist, out of which piles of money are spilling. Foster Dulles has his hand on a bomb in front of him, and on the bomb is painted the smiling face of Eisenhower. There's dead Guatemalan children, in case you missed the point. And then you see Guatemalan laborers bending under the weight of these banana stems that they're carrying up to a freighter that has an American flag on it. It's a very powerful picture. And I have spent hours, literally, staring at reproductions of that picture on the internet and elsewhere. I know every inch of that picture. As I was reaching the end of my research for my book, I decided I want to go see that picture. I want to see it in real life. My wife is an artist, and she keeps telling me, reproductions are nothing. A reproduction is not like seeing the picture. And particularly in this case, 16 feet long, I want to go there, and I want to commune with this picture. And so I was making a vacation in Mexico. It was in January, so it would have been just over a year ago. My wife and I went to Oaxaca, and I arranged to spend a day in Mexico City on the way home so I could see this picture. From Oaxaca, I called one of the many Diego Rivera foundations or museums, and I said, where's Glorious Victory? Where do I go to see it? And I got a very puzzled response. It was like the security guard at Dulles Airport. Really didn't know what I was talking about. They had kind of a vague idea. I was quite shocked. I know there's more than one. There's a whole bunch of Diego Rivera institutions in Mexico, and I thought maybe I wasn't calling the right one. I called several. It was long distance. And anyway, the short of it is I couldn't find the picture. And I had trouble locating it even when I came back to the U.S. I finally wound up having to hire somebody in Mexico to track it down. And here's the story that I discovered. Here's what happened to the picture. It had disappeared for over 30 years. No one knew where it was, all during the Cold War. And it wasn't until about 1990, with the Cold War over, that a handful of Mexican art historians, maybe they were sitting around some night over a Dos Equis, decided, we gotta find that picture. We gotta figure out what happened to Glorious Victory. So here's the story. Diego Rivera was a communist. He donated that picture to the people of the Soviet Union. The Soviets, however, did not like Diego Rivera. they didn't consider him a good communist because he had different opinions every day and he was very outspoken. Not to mention the fact that Trotsky was his house guest. So they never showed the picture, and the picture just disappeared. We now know, as a result of the investigation by these Mexican art historians, that it was kept in storage in Poland for many years, and finally it was sent to where it now is, which is the Pushkin Museum in Moscow. So I had to ask myself, am I willing to fly to Moscow for an hour just to stand in front of that picture? I thought about it for a little while and I decided, yes, I'm going to do it. So I figured out when I could go and I got in touch. It was also very difficult, but I finally found the person at the Pushkin Museum, the deputy director. And I got an email back, and this is what it said. I have it almost verbatim in my head. The picture you wish to see, Glorious Victory, is rolled up on a roll in one of our storage basements. If you come to Moscow, I can take you to the basement and show you the roll. But I cannot unroll it because we have no space. So this made me realize this masterpiece is essentially lost. It's not destroyed, but nobody can see it, and there's no prospect that anybody will ever be able to see it. Unless you buy the pitiful black and white reproduction in my book. Now, Alan Dulles loved this picture. He had color reproductions made out. He handed it out to people. He was so proud of it. Now, my feeling is that the people who need to see that painting are not in Russia. And they're actually not even in Guatemala, because the Guatemalans are painfully aware of what happened to them. The people who need to see that painting are here in the United States. It's us. And that brings me to my modest proposal. We should find a way to get that picture back from Moscow and display it in the United States. And I have the exact place for it. It should become the centerpiece of Dulles Airport. We put it right behind the bus. To put the bus in a little bit of context, maybe we have a few little plaques to raise questions about what they're doing and give us information about what happened. And perhaps, rather than airbrushing them out of our history, this would be a way for us to use the example of the Dulles brothers to ask us questions that might help us create a more just and a more peaceful world. Thank you.
That was great. Okay, we have, oh, this is a big audience. I didn't get to see everyone.